Okay, so what we're going to do, we're going to kind of fairly quickly go through what we did as part of this project and kind of probably up to sort of where I left. And then the most exciting part is what happened after I left, because that's where all the magic really happened. We'll try and make sure there's some time for questions as well. So Rebecca, do you want to kick off? Just talk about what was happening in the business at the time and where we were.
Perfect. So doing this within the UK, I don't need to introduce who John Lewis are, so that's good. So I've worked for John Lewis for 6 years actually, and the point that the Deloitte engagement was at a really interesting time for us, because it was the point over the last, well, it's been over the last couple of years that we've fully replatformed the website. So the change journey that we were on anyway within online was having come from a place of being an in-house built website, quite separate as an overall team from the main business, fast growing, small A agile, I would say. So historically, with not having used any agile practices formally, not having been engaged with Lean or Kanban or anything like that, but had grown from a relatively startup basis. So John Lewis Online's history is having bought a startup in the UK and invested on it and kept it separate from the main business for quite a number of years. The change cycle that was running was annual planning, standard big business stuff, but quite a lot of flexibility within it. The point that we got to was that the main platform wasn't going to sustain us for the level of growth and change, so embarked on a full replatforming. What that meant was that we had a period of what I think the overall Deloitte programme would have probably rather had as about an 18-month freeze that we pushed to be about a 6-month freeze, because that's what demanding commercial businesses do. And so I had a backlog of change, and we're entering a new world on a brand new e-commerce platform with a backlog of demand of business priorities, both from online and from other parts of the business, with an increasing strategic priority on online as it was delivering more numbers, and a real demand for both doing small tactical commercial pieces as well as bigger programs of change, so both in terms of big pieces of online change and big pieces of omni-channel changes affecting the stores as well. We also were in an environment where actually the process of replatforming had seen quite a bit of, well, a small amount in the total capability of the website, but a certain number of features dropped from the replatforming of the website. So certain elements in which the new platform was actually a step back from the old. So we started this year, it was around about February we got the new platform live. And so sitting in the position of sort of owning the online portfolio for John Lewis, we're in a position of kind of going, right, when do we get to start doing things on the new platform? We've got a backlog of change in terms of demand. We've got a backlog of change in terms of what we haven't managed to get onto this new platform. We've become much more part of this big organisation. We're much more integrated into a lot of the legacy systems that have their issues and slow development lead times and are having to be pushed to do 2 releases a year rather than 1. We're moving into this world and we've got increasing demand to do more, faster, better, smoother. Is really the picture of where we were.
Okay. So the first thing that happened is Deloitte had been helping with some other things, and we've been building some systems, and we started kind of engaging more in shared teams and in kind of mixed teams, and we were doing, I guess, what kind of traditional agile development, kind of fairly things that you would recognize if you've been, in agile teams. And then we started a conversation about how do we make this stuff sustainable. And so the first thing we did is we had a bit of an intervention. We had it's kind of typical sort of consulting project, right? So come and teach us agile. I said, okay, we can try that. So the first thing we did is we ran some training. And these pictures you see, these little things here, they are monsters made out of Play-Doh, because one of the things we do in our 2-day training course is we build monsters out of Play-Doh, which is an excellent way to learn how to build software. It turns out, and these were the 3 winners of the competition that we had at the end. So the first thing we did really is we did some training, but the training wasn't sort of, hey, this is Scrum, go do Scrum or whatever. What we really focused on, and I think it dovetails very nicely with the talk that Mike gave a bit earlier this morning, if you saw that, it's all about kind of the values and the principle. So what are the things that we believe in, and what are the things that are kind of important? And what we're trying to do is kind of instill some heuristics. So people say, hey, I can't tell you every situation you're going to come across, but if you have some good kind of decision filters and some good sort of values, you might make a good tactical decision yourself. And then we talked about examples of processes. And really the second part of that was about kind of co-designing. So what do we do now, and what things work really well and what things don't, and how do we kind of get that up there? That was quite interesting because we got very good participation. So it was kind of everybody in the business really that was going to be touched by this or have some part in delivering it were involved. And that was really important. You know, we learned a huge amount about what sort of things the UX guys were really worried about, you know, saying, are we going to be, you know, working more rapidly, not have quite as long time to design stuff? What sort of things the graphic designers thought were going to be challenging for them? You know, it was trying to get away from this sort of IT-only sort of view of the world. And once we'd done that for a bit, it kind of instilled some shared language and some ways of thinking about the type of delivery we wanted to do. We started working in mixed teams, so some people that are a bit more comfortable with this way of working and some people that are a bit new to it. And sort of over time, try to draw down on the external people, on the Deloitte people and the contractors and the other people that were helping. And that was kind of the team level process, right? And that kind of embedded itself. And you know what? It's kind of not a million miles away from Scrum. It's a little bit different, but it's not that different. The thing that was kind of a bit more challenging and a bit more interesting was the portfolio management piece. So as Rebecca talked about, huge amounts of demand and kind of an implicit promise that had been made to the business around this new platform. This is going to make everything easier and it's going to make it faster to deliver change and we're going to be much more, you know, responsive to business needs. What no one had possibly quite made clear was sort of the when, because the day after go live on the new platform with a very different technology to what we had previously, you know, IT isn't necessarily in a position to deliver huge amounts of change very, very quickly. And so there was a lot of expectation management and a lot of kind of this ever-growing list. And so what we did is we ran some much more focused kind of training about what is lean and what is Kanban and what are, you know, why do we care about things like Slack and flow and what do you do when you have a mixture of kind of bigger pieces that move slowly and smaller, more tactical pieces. And again, we talked about the principles and values, but really what we wanted to do was kind of co-design something. And the first kind of outcome of that looked a board a bit like this. So I apologize. I took this picture about a year ago or something, and I didn't know I was going to be presenting it, so it's not a very good picture, but I can't go back in time because it's changed. But there's a couple of things here that are quite important, right? So we talked about the governance process. And on top of here are basically the kind of the steps in the governance process that you have to go through. So you have to go and kind of get some funding, and you have to go and that's a kind of annual cycle, but there's some budget that you can dispense a little bit more over time. So we talk about some of those constraints and how they'd be difficult and easy. We had a section at the top, which are kind of little mini boards for risks and issues, right? So we had kind of risk identified and kind of in resolution, issue identified and in resolution. So we're trying to kind of bring those out and make them quite explicit. And then kind of over here, in the initial processes, different colored cards of sticky notes mean different types of work, right? So we had kind of some I think a blue ticket was a project, a yellow one was like a tactical change or something like that. So we divided the world into different types. And we said, look, it's probably quite a good idea to take a portfolio view of this that says, at any point in time, we want to have kind of at least some tactical stuff on the go because they're quick wins, leave a bit of capacity for some things that might be urgent, like production defects. And so we try to think about demand. And the thing I don't quite have a picture of, which was quite illustrative, is the backlog, the kind of the intake of work for this system, was a piece of paper about as big as one of the flip charts over there, turned on its side, so kind of horizontally, and with different swim lanes for different types of work. And we decided that the width limit on the backlog was how many sticky notes could you fit on, and this is normal size sticky notes, right? So that was the first point of negotiation, is how many sticky notes could we fit kind of lengthwise on a piece of paper that big. That was what the business wanted to have, and quite a long list, and yes, probably about a year and a half worth of work or something like that. So that's kind of what we did, and we started running stand-ups, and we started kind of having some quite good conversations, and this is kind of what that led to. So
the summary on what worked really well for us on that was that actually the structure of just moving across to having a stand-up on a weekly basis, because this was pulling in, the group that was being pulled around this board was a couple of team managers of larger teams involved in producing work, a couple of the key stakeholders, so reasonably senior people, so budget holders who are responsible for the commercial delivery, and then the project managers who are responsible leads on different pieces. The visualization of both progress, blockers, risks and issues, there was something about putting them up visually that actually made it a much less judgmental conversation about what was happening. What we found was quite quickly, it turns into much more genuine conversations about, well, what does that mean? is that really blocked? And then you start to get conversations actually coming from some of the senior team who aren't that directly involved in the development side saying, well, is that really blocked? Because actually I can just make that okay. Or is that really blocked because this is here? Or if that hasn't moved in the past week, what does that say about it? So we very quickly actually started using what we had there as a tool. The walk-by updates was in the sense that actually this was where this board was and still is situated is on the breakout area on the floor. So on the floor that most of the teams who are involved are working on, it's just there in the breakout area. It's a place that people come to reasonably often, and there are enough people who are aware of the content of what the board is about that again it's just surfacing conversations at a different level and pulling in a wider audience. The link between the bottom, what worked well, and the top, and what didn't work, was the conversation about how work actually moved on to the board. So what we didn't get to, and haven't got to, is a genuine kind of pull sense of, right, we've now got capacity here, what are we going to pull in? Because the focus has much more been on managing, do we understand what's coming next? And so there's never been a genuine kind of sense of, it's a little bit the reverse conversation, it's still on the push side, but it has at least led to a more structured conversation about what is coming next, what have we got lined up. So it's a subtle distinction, but we're still having the conversations about the push rather than the pull. Tracking features, as it was shown on the previous image, but you'd have done very well if you could see it from that. So tracking the feature level on the projects that are moving through turned out just to become an admin exercise. The basis was that at the point that the group were talking in front of the board, if it's a project that had 30 feature sets in it, by the time you've got layered in groupings, kind of 6 groupings of 5 of the feature sets with 0.6 type on from what had been printed out from Jira, it was a fascinating afternoon for someone to be moving those around the board, but actually when it came to stand up, no one could read what was on them anyway. So on a most basic level, we fairly quickly instituted a rule that nothing should go up on it that couldn't be read from about this distance from it. Which on one level sounds daft and really small, but it meant that we ensured that actually what was going up there could be, whether it was literally read in terms of the word, or you could get a visual read from it, you needed to be able to do that from about 6-10 foot away, otherwise it wasn't the right place on the board. The other piece that hasn't worked so well for us is actually dependencies with other parts of the business. So online is a very significant piece of the business, but there's very little that the teams within online and within the IT guys who directly work with online can deliver without also touching quite a few other teams. There are good conversations happening about what does this mean and how do we then pull in the inputs from other teams, but I wouldn't say we've got there on the ways of working with them.
I think one of the observations for me at the time was that we were looking at one team doing one type of work, and you can't kind of boil the ocean. You can't suddenly throw your toes out of the pram and demand that the rest of the organization completely change the way that it works. So things like the annual budgeting planning cycle, you can do things with it, right? So you can say, hey, we have some placeholders here and we're going to disperse that budget ourselves. But you're not necessarily going to kind of say, actually, it'd be really great if we could just have a priority decision with you every 2 weeks about what we're going to, where we're going to spend our money. Because the rest of the organization wasn't geared up for that. And maybe in time they will be, but it's actually, you can't really, if you did that, you would just get so much resistance that nobody would really buy into it and you'd be shut down from the higher powers. The other thing that's interesting is, if you look at the senior stakeholders most directly kind of affected by this, so the head of the website, for example, they were speaking quite positively about this because suddenly they were seeing things in a way that they hadn't been able to see before. I'm sure there was all there on status reports, but actually they were much more engaged with it because it was much more tangible. And I think that, again, just caused a lot of very good conversations. So we then finished the work, and this was going up and running, and Rebecca was running this stand-up every week and whatever. And what's really fascinating to me is to kind of see where it's got to, because in some ways, if the team has the ability to evolve this thing and it's still there, 6-9 months later, then maybe it has a chance of success. If it was going to die the day I left the building, that would have been quite a big shame. So now we have a board, and I'm going to show you the backlog piece here. So the first part is, this hasn't really changed a lot. It's been simplified a bit, but essentially these little bits over here, my laser pointer stopped working. These little bits over here are, this is kind of projects These ones are kind of tactical changes, small kind of 1-2 week type things. The mobile stream is managed quite separately because they're a separate team and they kind of work in a slightly different way. And then we have the kind of expedite stuff that's coming in, like urgent production issue, whatever. But now we have kind of 3 projects and 5 tacticals, whereas when I left, we had 15 projects and like 200 tacticals or something. And nobody dared take anything off because, oh my God, you're going to forget about it, it's never going to get done. It was 2 years down the line, it was never going to get done anyway, but sometimes you have to kind of play along. The board itself is quite interesting too. So what's happened is changed quite a bit, right? And the risk initiative bits are still there, but they're more prominent. Some of the kind of pre-visioning stuff, there's things that are like, we're just doing an exploration. It's got its own little board onto the side. The board itself has mostly the same structure, and I'll let Rebecca talk about any kind of details of it, because every day. But one of the things I'll say about it very briefly is that this looks like a Kanban board that somebody cares about, right? Like it's drawn with nice straight lines, and it's very tightly laid out, and it's different than what it was. And I think there's an element of kind of ownership and pride in it, which is quite encouraging to see. I think you can kind of tell almost whether someone cares about it or not, and how neatly it's drawn. Is there anything you want to highlight?
So it's really interesting actually that just coincidentally the point that I happened to take this photo was that for the project that's running along the top here, which has been to do with a bunch of work on the John Lewis checkout, so has moved from one phase to another, so has completed a whole bunch of security-based changes, and is moving into a phase looking more focused on directly customer experience and streamlining. So what that meant was the team had been working on a burn-up chart, demonstrating where they were against their minimum, against feature sets, etc. Then they basically had got the last of that work into production and were basically drawing breath and revisioning on the work for streamlining. So took their velocity chart down on the basis that they weren't producing anything. Within 2 days, that got a comment and a question. So very quickly, whilst it's the detail of the burn-up charts, the senior stakeholders don't expect all of them to. A couple of them do because they're interested, but in the main it's just kind of, okay, yeah, if the line goes up, it's going faster. Brilliant, good. But as soon as one got taken off, and very visually clearly taken off, it was like, oh, what does that mean? What's happened? Are they not working? No, they're back there. They sort of, oh, I get it. Right, good. So when are we going to see their velocity again? And it's just very interesting how that's happened, that there's a level of understanding that the people who are right in the project have on it and wanting to give the right representation of what they're doing. There's then different levels of understanding of the different stakeholders. There are some people, so I'm not going to lie, there are some people in the business for whom we may have taken some time to explain this 2 or 3 times, and it's still just the whole concept of visually representing work like this, having discussions around priority based on a stand-up basis, looking at this, rather than having thick reams of A4 paper in front of them. There are some people for whom this is at the moment still too much of a jump, and who are basically saying, well, that's a nice, interesting thing that you're doing in the breakout area, now can you please send me a report? And so there are those conversations happening in parallel. So this is not everyone has come beautifully into the new world and is all singing and happy clappy, but we're using it quite actively. The burn-up charts are interesting. I still believe them to be slightly over-complex, but my team are happy with them and use them, so it's theirs. And then we have the run down the bottom, it's probably worth mentioning, which has loads of tickets, is for the tactical changes that we're still representing on a ticket level because they're of a size that they can write it on the posters. And
I mean, maybe the thing to think about, the reason the statistics are kind of on here, and previously we tried to break the projects down into smaller features and sort of tracking them, is that actually on a project basis, something could stay there for quite a long time. Yeah. And one of the initial pieces of feedback we got from the senior group was, I keep showing up to this weekly meeting and nothing's changed. The project's still where it was before. And yeah, that's true because it's like a 3-month project, but at a portfolio level, you need to be able to reason about both those slightly larger pieces that, legitimately have to be quite large because that's how long it takes to get to a point where we're happy to release it, as well as the more smaller tactical things that are maybe, we'll do 5 of these and whenever there's a release window, they'll just drop in. So trying to give some semblance of progress tracking, even though we weren't kind of necessarily looking at tickets. And by the way, the teams themselves were using either Jira or physical boards would have a kind of a story level, their own little board tracking their progress, but far too much detail for any of the senior stakeholders. So that was kind of what we got to, and this is the final slide, and we're running out of time, I think. So these are kind of some of the key lessons. Again, Rebecca, do you want to take this?
So definitely the piece about starting when we have control, there's a level of, you kind of have control, you have influence, you have opportunity to influence, and then there's don't even go there until you can demonstrate that something's working really well. And it's definitely not, there's no point us jumping up and down and saying everyone should come in this direction with us. It's really about getting it running, demonstrating some success, and then seeing where we go. It's fair to say, and this was probably from a interesting conversation Mark and I had over coffee the other week when we just updated on where it was at, is that compared to a lot of what's being talked about here over the next couple of days, and the wider kind of what Kanban really means in an organisation, what we're doing with a board and discussing a portfolio in this way is definitely shallow. This is not the full end-to-end, this is not full pull-through, this is not a full flow way of thinking, it's not linking all the teams, but we're getting some benefits from it. It's a really different set of meetings than you have with RAG reports. It's a very different conversation in front of something visual than it is in front of status reports. It's just different. The questions that it prompts tend to be from a place of curiosity and genuinely wanting to understand, less so than the kind of finger-pointing questions which actually most traditional kind of project management reports lend themselves to. So it's a better quality of conversation that we're having. The piece that I would mention as well is actually stay really open to iterating and moving it forward. There is a sense where actually we're just starting to run, if you go back a second, sorry, I should be able to do that myself. We're starting to hit something really interesting here, that we haven't quite defined our done and receiving benefits bit quite right. Because at what point are we really closing the project and saying it's all done, and if a bit's gone into production and we're receiving some value from it but not the whole thing, so having taken it back up to a project level rather than feature set, this isn't quite working. We haven't got our next iteration of what we want to try on it, but we're open to saying, yep, that needs to be better. So it's just to keep challenging. If it feels like it stayed the same, what could you be doing differently?
And maybe just a kind of final observation from me. I think, you know, David talked this morning about consulting and how consultants say, well, I'm an evil consultant, right? And I don't think this project was perfect. I think it was interesting. I think we learned a lot. But my feeling is that if this kind of thing is going to work, you can accelerate, I think, by bringing in new perspectives and new ideas. I'm sure that's what a lot of the coaches and people do. But you need to find the people in the organization that are kind of, that get it, that are going to run with it, that think this is useful to them, and that are going to be the champions to sustain it, right? In this case, this was Rebecca, and Rebecca was in a very good position because she runs this part of the business. You know, the portfolio is hers. And I think I may have been unlucky, and I may have found someone that had no interest in that. It would have taken a much longer time, or it might have been impossible to try and get that type of buy-in, right? The thing that, did we start exactly with what we do now? I think we did on the governance side, and probably less so at the team side, because there was the thing that John Lewis wanted to buy from us was, hey, make our teams agile overnight. And we said, well, we can't really do that, but we can help you with some other stuff. So there's a little bit of a bit of a jump in change that shows something is different. But actually, we weren't really trying to boil the ocean, and we were saying, hey, rest of the organization, we don't look any different to you, but we have a much better idea of how we're controlling ourselves. And I think that's allowed the team to kind of prove that this stuff works, rather than it being sort of shut down. Yeah, we tried that. So that's everything we have. I think we've got maybe a couple of minutes of questions, if anybody wants to ask anything.
You said about the board and the fact you're able to have good conversations around it, but some managers would still insist on traditional report. Basically, that's all very well, but please give me a proper report. And then interestingly, later on, when you said that traditional reports, RAG reports, for example, often basically contain a whole bunch of finger points.
Yeah.
What kind of reports did you end up giving those senior managers once you started establishing good conversations, but they still insisted on it?
That's a very good question.
Green.
It is hard to overstate how bureaucratic bits of John Lewis are. So in the main, if someone was wanting it, I would just go, I have just gone with the kind of like, right, well, here's the standard template that's getting used. We will just do that, and we'll just do it in a light touch way. I guess what I was really referencing on the finger pointing is there's just the way that quite often, by the time, if you've got a full risk log against a project, it should be quite a constructive thing that is about risk and mitigation, who's doing what and where it's going. And quite often at the point that gets summarised up onto a high-level report, this particular bit that I'm thinking of, you just get, this thing could go really wrong and that person owns it. And it's particularly around risk, but you get a few other bits that end up being just tagged like that on very standard status reports. So no, I haven't solved status reports in general. It's particularly the risk bit, that kind of risk and issue side that I was thinking of in saying it. I've never been the biggest fan of writing big reports anyway. Anything else? Yes, so
your boss is allowing us to.
So it's a couple of things. It's probably a couple of things that are worth mentioning. So Paul Kobe, who's the IT director, actually was the one who made the first move to say, right, we need to bring Agile into online. And so since Deloitte are in doing replatforming, I think they got first dibs on it. Was that fair?
Yeah, probably.
Sorry, no, the
Because we're so
excellence
great at
within
it.
Deloitte Digital meant that brought them to do that piece. So that was led from the IT side. And it was much more that fairly quickly what sort of I would say, within online it's not a big IT side, business side piece, but what we on the business side leapt on quite quickly was saying we're much bigger than we were a number of years ago. This is a route to get us back to a bit more of that almost startup, small A agility. So within online, we just kind of took some of the permission to work a bit more like this. And then myself and a couple of others have provided a bit of air cover from some of the sticks. So the guys who are doing it can get on with it. And I can sit in some meetings and nod and go, yep, no, you're right. Yep, we'll do some more paper reports as well, that's fine.
And sometimes it is just about this kind of this service orientation type piece that part of the business didn't necessarily look all that different to other parts of the business unless they decided to look under the covers. You know, so the interface between the other parts of the business or the major strategic portfolio programs and kind of the delivery piece might have looked quite similar, but what was happening underneath in terms of detailed prioritization, tracking, management was a lot more innovative and was evolving a lot faster than maybe what they were realizing. And only those who kind of cared, like, oh, is that what you're doing? That's interesting. You know.
Yeah. And there's a lot that we're doing also about topping and tailing, so we're not trying to challenge the business fundamentals. So the way that budgeting works as an annual process, there's no point us trying to challenge that. It's about us working with people and saying, right, so how do we make that work with us? So there is an element of picking the things that are worth challenging.
Then you pick dates, our dates of delivery.
That gets more into the Agile and the Scrum side. Yeah, dates are really interesting. Yeah.
Can you elaborate? Because if you're not challenging the business, then the business is expecting some delivery.
So we are working to delivery dates. We're strongly working to date, and but it's about flexing scope around that. So we're getting people on the piece about saying, right.
So you might challenge the detail of what gets delivered, right? So they say, because we have a go live in the stores, which is a different part of the business, and this has to coincide, moving the date is quite expensive for the rest of the business. However, you know, you can have this much functionality online or that much functionality online, and what we try to do is deliver at least the minimum, and hopefully a lot more, but there is some negotiation around the scope. So, you know, at the priority team level, it looks like there's a lot more flexibility maybe than at the kind of big block annual planning cycle. And that kind of works with both parties.
And my view, which I state often, is that actually where we've committed to dates previously and where other parts of the business commit to dates or more standard methods, it's equally as meaningless as committing to a date here. It's just we'll be more explicit about what we're not committing to when we say that date. Whereas if you sign off a big document and it's very waterfall, you appear to give a lot more certainty, but there's actually no more certainty there.
And I think the other part of it is there are some things that have dependencies and some things that don't. So there are the tactical pieces, for example, are much more within online's control, and so they can choose to allocate that capacity. That's almost the slack, if you like. So like if someone that has to sacrifice for the bigger pieces, at least you've got a little bit of a buffer there that you could use. So kind of to take the things that are in your control.
If you're wanting to commit to all your directors, you've got to deliver this amount, but you're still trying to work agile within the team. So you're still, you've got this big backlog of stuff that you're committing over here, but actually, how are you setting the expectation when actually the top part of that is going to get delivered, and you only know that maybe a couple of months or a month before the 12-month project is
It's some painful conversations, and it's getting people as close to the process as possible. So it's getting people to, not every day into daily stand-ups, but it's getting them kind of, okay, you've seen what we're doing with the portfolio. Okay, right, well, if you want to understand that project better, let's get you to one of the demos. Let's get you to, okay, so this is what it's meaning when we're saying this. Yeah, and then when it comes to the crunch of, here's the list of things that we wanted to see pre-peak, and there's only going to be 5 of them, not 8 of them, it's the same conversation that you have without this.
And the other side of that, which
it doesn't actually, that hard conversation about can we get there for that date doesn't really change.
But it's also a little bit about, at a point of commitment, what do you know, right? So again, we didn't go through all the detail, but there's a piece there called kind of pre-visioning and visioning, which are the kind of like, what is this project? Is it even a good idea? And out of that comes some things that we try and give us a basis of sizing. Is this a project of this kind of template or that sort of template? And we have some idea about how long it takes us to deliver those. So actually, we can start to use past performance to try and forecast future performance. I'd suggest that probably it's not quite as scientific as that yet.
So to be a bit more explicit, because I'm aware that I'm being intentionally vague on some of the stuff about what this means and sizing the dates and everything. So there's a piece of work that we got signed off for a certain amount of money and said we think it's roughly this timescale. We then spent some more time looking at it, and we're going back to say, you know what, it's twice as big. So can we have twice as much money in his timescale? But you're finding that out really early before we've spent all of the first chunk of money you gave us. So you're actually finding that out much sooner. So we're having some of those conversations.
I suspect we're over time. Should we wrap up? Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.